Because students have a tendency to think when they're greeted with the topic of texture and detail that they're really kind of going in to just make a very pretty drawing, they often get caught up on the concept of form shading. And that's basically where you've got an object, and here, let's just draw let's draw a box. That's the name of the game, right? So you've got a form. Excuse the shitty box. Anyway, you've got a form, and based on where your light source is, let's say it's over here, some sides are darker than others. So the surfaces that are facing the light source get lighter, and as they turn away from the light source, they get darker. So right now I'm obviously just working with two tones, but this is essentially a pretty good simplification of what form shading is. The shading itself goes on the form in question because it's how the surfaces themselves determine what color they're going to be from their orientation, or what value they're going to be, I guess. And so, usually with most drawing courses, they'll jump into shading right off the bat, because that's basically the tool that they have to show that something is three-dimensional. We, on the other hand, take a very different route. We have a lot of other tools that are much more effective at conveying that something is 3D. We can draw through our forms. We can use contour lines to help describe how that surface moves through 3D space. And the key thing here is that our goal is different from all those other drawing courses, because they do focus on how can we teach you how to draw something good, draw something that looks right, that looks correct, that looks interesting, whatever. The goal here, as I've discussed before, is not about drawing pretty things. It's about everything is an exercise to teach you how to understand space. So drawing through your forms, as long as it makes you believe and understand how the form you've drawn exists in 3D space, that's perfectly okay. Contour lines, having random lines that just run along the surface of the form, to an extent at least, that's perfectly okay, as long as they're contributing to your understanding of that form, and as long as they are actually, like, they have a job to do and they're doing that job well. As soon as you end up with so many contour lines that they're, that it's entirely overdone, these are not accomplishing anything, then it becomes a problem. But until then, these tools are entirely appropriate and they're effective. Now, students will still, once they're getting into detail and texture, they have a tendency to just lump in shading and rendering, and really like capturing how the surface is oriented relative to the light. Of course, they don't think of it in those terms, but so that's the problem, is that it doesn't fit well within this course, and so usually I will discourage the use of shading. There are cases where shading is actually a very good tool, but I'll get into that in a second. Generally, what I'm talking about is this kind of shading where you've got a lot of generic hatching lines. Like, because you can control their density, you can make them appear to be more dark or more sparse in order to give a sense of a value scale, even though you can only really draw in flat black. So they'll try and use these kinds of generic patterns that don't really tell you anything more in order to get a scale from light to dark. And the thing is that it tends to look like crap. All we have is a fine liner that makes very nice, rich, dark lines like this Photoshop brush does. Obviously, I'm not using a fine liner right now. And it'll vary in terms of line weight based on the pressure that we use, but that's about all we've got. The result still ends up looking very scratchy and unpleasant. More importantly, this shading doesn't actually contribute any real value to what we're doing, to the exercise. Sure, if you shade nicely, it can make your drawing look nice, but it doesn't make it look more three-dimensional because we have better tools to achieve that. It just becomes decoration. Now that leads into a situation where it is appropriate to use shading. If you use shading and the need that shading has to achieve a gradient from light to dark, if you use that need for a gradient as an excuse to include some textural information, well, then that ends up being useful because now you're actually using it to describe what is the surface, what is that surface like? So you're giving more information to the viewer about what this surface feels like, what kind of little forms and bumps and things are along it, and now that's great. Now, conversely, it is perfectly okay just not to shade. Just use basic constructional techniques to achieve the illusion of three-dimensional form. That's perfectly okay. Drawabox is not fundamentally a course on texture and detail. It is a course on construction, on understanding form. So if you go back to the 6 major concepts that we tackle in this course, none of them are texture. There is visual communication, which this one does play a role in, but you choose what you want to communicate. So if you want to communicate the textural, surface, then you leverage these techniques. But it is not at the core of what we're going over. So I just want you to understand that. I don't ever want to see any generic hatching lines because that is always going to be a missed opportunity to do this instead. So just to summarize that, this is bad, this is entirely fine, even though we're not getting into texture there, and this is great. But don't go into texture until you are confident in the forms that you've constructed. Because without a good grasp of how this surface turns in space, you won't be able to wrap that texture around it properly, and then you'll just end up adding more detail that just flattens everything out. Because every single line you add to your drawing it creates more contour lines, and if those contour lines are incorrect, if they're telling the viewer this is actually just a flat surface, then that's the impression the viewer gets. So always focus on construction first, then you can worry about texture, and don't use hatching lines for shading.